next up, if you're happy, if we can pull the slides up for Neil. Are you doing your own, or you're happy for us to?
I'll do my own.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, you're so great. Are you happy to share your slides?
Yeah, give me a sec.
Brilliant. Thank you, Neil. I'll get.
Can you see those?
Yes, we can.
Brilliant. Or that, I suppose. So yeah, hi everybody. It was weird. I was at an event with Claire recently speaking down a camera, and we couldn't see who we were speaking to, and I've got that feeling again today. So I'm going to imagine some faces, hope for the best. So male suicide prevention at Samaritans. I was putting this together and I thought, well, I could share the things we're doing, but that would probably take all day. There's so many things Samaritans do, so I tried to sort of cherry pick stuff that Samaritans are doing that's particularly focused, obviously, on men and particularly focused on Wales. So I've bolded the prevention word, and that's because Samaritans believe that suicides can be prevented. Can't necessarily always be prevented, but we believe there's a strong chance of prevention in many cases. So a lot of our work is very much focused on action to achieve that prevention of suicides. And I will be squarely focused on suicide prevention, although Samaritans are not just here for suicide prevention purposes. We're very much here to support people, as the flyer on my first slide there says, whenever people are in a difficulty, whenever they need support and whatever they're facing. So I'm going to do a bit of who and a bit of why and a bit of when and where and how. So try and answer some of those questions. And I thought I would start by looking at some of that who in terms of who's at risk. So I'm not going to do like a big deep dive into data. You've had some of that today, but I just wanted to refresh, just talk over some of the themes around who's at risk in terms of the male population around suicide. But really just because I wanted to share some thoughts with you, things that we talk about as a team, because we think about male suicide prevention an awful lot as a charity, and particularly in the Wales team, it's something we've given an awful lot of thought to in recent years and challenged ourselves to try and think differently about and come up with different solutions, because patently there's a lot of stagnancy in the annual suicide statistics in Wales and at UK level, and males are stubbornly accounting for sort of high percentages of those suicides. So in terms of who's at risk, this really just some themes born from the type of data we look at, ONS data, the real-time surveillance data we look at, and Samaritans' own research into this area. So middle age, a slight shift last year in the age bracket there, but broadly middle-aged men most at risk. Poverty, social exclusion is big sort of underlying risk factor. Loneliness and isolation. Personality traits, so tendencies towards certain behaviours, but both the male population as a whole relative to the female population, so a tendency to act or do things at shorter notice, shall we say, and then individual personality traits towards towards taking action or radical action to address a circumstance, which can manifest as suicidal action. Life events, and I'll come back to this, and it's been touched on earlier today. So aside from those underlying risk factors, major life events such as relationship breakdown, job loss, engagement with the criminal justice system, for example. Emotional literacy, and a sort of burden of masculinity. I was actually looking at Samaritans' research the other day, and we had this just labelled as masculinity. But I think, you know, we'd all be familiar with, not least these days, a lot of the challenges males face trying to navigate the world and trying to understand what kind of man they should be, and the different pressures we feel as men on our sense of identity, and they're often competing. You know, it sometimes feels to me there's a personal reflection that we're sort of simultaneously expected to be a lot of what men used to have to be, but also to be a lot of new things too. And squaring that circle can be a real challenge for a lot of men. So I thought I'd deep dive into one aspect of this. So obviously we've got demographic data in terms of risk at all sorts of levels, ethnicity, age, you know, location. I thought I'd just dive into one of those sort of areas and look at suicide by occupation. Not really because I'm going to go down this rabbit hole, but because I think it presents some interesting issues. So it's been mentioned already today, skilled trades occupation, so kind of construction and trades, the highest risk employment sector in Wales. The suicides is this ONS data from 21, 34 deaths of males by suicide from skilled trades occupations. And I was speaking at a construction event recently, and I shared this, and And I did point out to them that actually there were 76 deaths in not classified, which you can see at the bottom of this table. So if someone ever says to you, construction's the highest risk employment sector, it sort of is and it isn't. Most of the suicides of males in Wales are actually in unclassified professions, and that captures a whole range of people not in employment, people who are retired, people who are in professions that don't neatly fall into one of ONS's boxes. And I think it's really important to remember that. The other thing is to highlight that when you're thinking about how to reach men, support men, prevent suicides, it's very easy to think, well, okay, construction, there's lots of risk there, and there is. Both suicide risk, but also broader mental health challenges. But actually 34 suicides in a workforce, which as best as I can tell is well over 100,000, largely men in Wales working in construction and trades. You quickly realise it's really hard to target your efforts and your energies. So if we went out as a charity and tried to engage with everyone in the construction supply chain, big and small, we'd run out of energy pretty quickly. And a lot of that effort would probably prove to be white noise, certainly in terms of reaching and supporting those most at risk. It's not to say it's not worth work that's worth doing, but it certainly means you have to think about how you go about that work. And then if you look at why might there be risk in the trade and construction sector? Well, at the top, you've got all the kind of sector-specific risk factors, and you could do this for any employment sector. You could take farming and say, well, a risk factor is access to means of suicide, and it is in trades and construction too, to some extent. But it's precarious employment, it's fatigue and pain, physical pain. It's a work hard, play hard type of culture, broadly low pay. And if I can move my Teams box, yeah, the broader employment culture has not historically certainly been one that's kind of supportive and conducive to employee well-being and mental health. And often people are working in really different on site. If you went to a building site these days, you'd find people working often on their own or working in small groups of people who are brought together to do one job, and there's not often the opportunity to build up lasting relationships. But aside from the sector-specific factors, in any employment sector, you've got all the underlying risk factors. So why construction and trades? Well, aside from the fact people work in construction, they're much more likely working in construction to come from backgrounds of low income, of poverty and social exclusion. Obviously, you've got the life events, things that can happen in anybody's lives can play out for someone working in construction and trades. And then this big basket of non-work risk factors. So people who work in construction are more likely than the general population to substance misuse, alcohol and drugs. And so that plays out then at a sector level. So it's really important when you look at a given sector of employment, you look at any given demographic of males and say, well, are they at risk, to disentangle? Well, to what extent is that because of where they work or what ethnicity they belong to, or what underlying risk factors are at play? Skip on to the next slide. So a bit more on why and when. I've referenced here Rory O'Connor's When It's Darkest book, which I think is a fabulous book and really explores particularly male suicide. And he really explores the psychological states of failure, of burden, of shame that men can feel when they take themselves beyond that crisis point into considering suicide as a sort of seemingly viable or best choice for them. And crucially, a choice that they will often articulate as feeling like will ease the burden on others. So feeling trapped, a lack of immediacy of support around them, and crucially pain. Rory talks a lot about pain. And I think looking back to that construction slide, whilst in the construction sector, it's sort of physical pain. And Rory O'Connor's largely talking about kind of psychological pain. Pain is a real driver for suicide, and suicide for some people can become the seemingly rational way out of that pain. So when we look at all of this, well, who and why and when, I'm only really sharing these thoughts because the conversations we have around those are the ones that try and help us focus down. And I guess get beyond the question, that headline question you expect me to answer of how do we prevent male suicides? So I think a better question, and the question we're trying to ask, is how do we support those men most at risk of suicide? And I guess more than that, how do we support them at the right times in the right places? Because if you took a slice of who's at risk of suicide in any given year and you just looked at the demographic risk factors, in most years, most of those men will not be at risk of suicide. And it's identifying those moments and those triggers in people's lives and those events that take somebody from being at risk because of who they are, where they come from, how old they are, where they work, to actually becoming somebody who's at risk of suicide, which is a different space. And it's often those life events and those triggers that will be the things that tip people into that space. So how do we engage men? So Claire's going to get worried now because I always get the balls talk out, but a lot of efforts to engage men in recent years around mental health and suicide prevention come from a similar space, really. There's been a big effort over the last few decades to get men to talk more, to open up, and I think to a large extent that's been successful. But I really think we need to move beyond a lot of that stuff. For a start, there's this sort of well-intentioned effort often, and the Samaritans have done this too, when we try and engage men to really speak to them as men and to speak to men as kind of one homogenous group. And that ends up with us kind of, it's burly looking rugby players in pub toilets looking at us from posters and telling us that it's tougher to talk and it takes balls to talk and all of this stuff. And you can see where this stuff comes from, but I find it really problematic. So one, because it tries to sort of treat men as all one thing, and if you were going to market a product to men, you wouldn't do that. You would segment your audience and recognize that all men are different. I think the effort to sort of appeal to male sense of manliness is highly problematic, because often those issues of masculinity are right at the heart of why people are in crisis. And also many men aren't walking around trying to be tough and masculine. That's just not a concern for them. And also crucially, and I think more crucially than all of that, a lot of the efforts to engage men throw the challenge to the individual, and in doing so, they do two things. One, they assume that when men do talk, they'll get the right type of support, and we know that's often not the case, not least where they try and engage with statutory services. Support is often just not there for them when they need it, and in terms of suicide prevention, it needs to be very immediate. And two, it assumes that if they speak to friends, to family, to others, that those people have got the capacity to support them. And I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case. I think however good your friends and family and colleagues are, many people aren't really well equipped to support somebody who's in crisis, and they'll do things like try and solve a problem, or they'll give examples of their own challenges in response, and they won't necessarily do some of the things that Samaritans we would do to respond. Samaritans have done a fair bit of research in recent years on what works in terms of engaging men. Sorry, my voice is drying up. We did a piece of work during the pandemic where we brought together focus groups of men who've used our services from our lived experience panel and beyond, and talked to them about what types of services and activities they would value. And you can see on the screen, this really fed back a lot of what some of you will have heard around men really wanting to engage in social type situations, considering how activities and goals related to activities can be used to encourage a conversation. So bringing men together, getting them doing things and allowing conversation to flow from that. And I guess men's sheds would be the best example of that type of thing. There's references on the slide to repair cafes and so on. There was also men fed back to us how we should advertise services. So use abstract imagery, posters and ad campaigns that showed the activity which formed the basis of the service were the most appealing, and not necessarily always using pictures of men looking kind of gloomily into the distance. And I know myself as a kind of marketing, from a marketing background, that's not necessarily the thing that's going to connect with a man in crisis. So in terms of service intervention, some useful findings there. But I alluded a minute ago to that ask of men to open up, to talk, go and talk to your GP, go and talk to a friend, a colleague. I wonder if there might be something of a listening deficit. And while Samaritans have done a lot of work in recent years to train people in suicide prevention awareness and so on, and we have historically shared our listening tips, I think what you're going to see from us in Wales in the coming years is a greater emphasis on that promotion of listening. So I would really love to see a Wales of great listeners. And Samaritans and others sharing our expertise. Our volunteers have got fantastic expertise in terms of listening, and training to become a Samaritans volunteer takes a long time, and that's because we really train people to be excellent listeners. And we think actually getting out into places like the construction sector and other environments where men are at risk, and actually just upskilling people to be better listeners, to be better placed to support and listen to colleagues, to friends, to family, would close some of that deficit and take some of the burden off the man in crisis to kind of step forward and share all without necessarily getting the response that they need. So yeah, listening skills, you're going to hear a lot more of us, and I think I can think of some applied ways in which that will work with males in particular, and I'll come back to that a bit later. So in terms of Samaritans, I'll try and rattle through this quickly because I'm conscious of time. What are we doing? So we've got our core helpline. Samaritans has operated for 70 years now. Started in England. We have 9 branches and an outreach hub in Wales with circa 800, 900 volunteers working day and night, so 24/7 to take calls. So in 2021, these figures are from, we took 130,000 calls. That's a call every 4 minutes. People don't just call us because they're suicidal. Top 5 reasons for calling you can see on the slide. Although it is the case, people call us when they're suicidal, and people call us sometimes in the act of suicide, and our listeners will listen to them and talk to them as they wish. So crucially, Samaritans is a completely anonymous service, which always hampers us in terms of caller data. In comparison to call and other kind of statutory helplines, always have this wealth of caller data. We're completely anonymous, non-judgmental service, really centered around compassion, the act of human compassion through listening. It's a bilingual service we operate, so our Welsh line operates 7 p.m. till 11 at the moment, but we've got plans to rebuild our Welsh line on a new system and in the coming years to seek to extend our hours of service, really with the aim of achieving parity 24/7. And we're a listening service, so we're not therapy. We do a small amount of signposting, but we really listen to people, help them explore their thoughts and feelings, and help them end the call in a better place than when they started it. And they may want to call us again another time, and that's fine too. But we're here to listen. So that's our helpline. A few areas I banged into one slide, but I could talk for half an hour about each of these. And these sort of don't specifically, but squarely hit large male audiences by virtue of the sectors we work in. So in prisons, we operate a prison listener scheme in every single UK prison, where our volunteers go in and train inmates in prisons to listen to others. So we create teams of peer listeners, and you can see one there pictured at the back of the listener. So I've been into a couple of prisons and met listening teams. A fantastic thing to see. It's really valued by the prison services and operators. It's really valued by inmates. It allows people to go and have an anonymous conversation, to share. It has a really positive impact on levels of self-harm and suicide in the prison estate. And I think the fact it operates across the UK speaks to that. And it has huge benefits for the listeners too. They speak hugely positively about how good an experience it is for them developmentally, and many go on after they leave the prison estate to use those skills in the rest of their lives. Also from prison, almost in every UK prison, inmates have a mobile or access to a phone line where they can ring Samaritans. So we take high volumes of calls from people within the prison estate every day. And I'd be remiss of me not to mention that not all of those calls are the types of calls we'd want. We get a lot of problem calls from prisons, because if you give someone a phone and they've got lots of time on their hand, they won't necessarily use that for the right purposes. But we also take a lot of calls from people who are in crisis and suicidal. And so that's why we offer that service. So Samaritans is often the only or one of the only people you can call if you're in prison. Network Rail and Rail. So across the UK, we're in partnership with Network Rail, and now in Wales and the Core Valleys line with Transport for Wales are in partnership. So this is like a full-fledged partnership that sees us training up rail staff, providing support to people who witness incidents, suicidal incidents on the rail infrastructure where there are a large number of incidents. We do physical mitigations work with rail operators to prevent access and address issues at problem hotspots. At stations and on the lines where there's high risk. We have an officer who works sort of half out of our Wales team and now just serves Wales, who will be straight to those stations where there's been an incident to go and support the teams. It's hugely valued by the rail service, by the employees. They are passionate about what we do. And just to flag, I started this by talking about prevention. Our rail partnership across the UK in the last few years is evidencing over 300 life-saving interventions made in a given year, which is roughly the number of suicides we see in Wales in a given year. So that speaks to the fact that it is possible to prevent suicides if you put practical services and projects in place in places where there's high risk and where there's a means of mitigating. And that gives me huge hope that we should be thinking of similar and different projects that can achieve the same aim. And then we have a veterans app as well, squarely to meet the needs of the veterans community. They can log into, and there's a whole sort of self-help service within that and direct access to Samaritans listeners. The farming project, I'll have to be really quick here. We've just kicked off. We'll be launching at the Royal Welsh Show in a few weeks. Bryony's on this call somewhere, and she's leading this project. Really excited about this. So we're working in partnership with Tir Dairy. For the next couple of years, we're going to be going into young farmers clubs, primarily in Mid Wales, but I think it'll be felt beyond that, to work with groups of young farmers to help reduce the stigma around talking about suicide, raise awareness of support available, build a peer support network. And really the aim between what we can offer as Samaritans and what Tir Dairy can offer is to set them off into their farming careers far better equipped than the previous generations were. You know, the farming industry is hugely challenging at the moment. It doesn't jump up as a kind of volume risk of suicide, but there are suicides in farming, and they're certainly felt and are known, not least because the farming community talks and is very close. And you'll see that at the shows over the summer. So suicides are really felt. They have a huge impact in the farming community across Wales. And this project is an effort to kind of break that cycle of risk. And our aim is that this generation of farmers moving through have a lower, if not much lower risk of suicide by virtue of being involved in this project. Outreach and the lottery bid. So all of our branches in Wales do outreach work in the community to varying degrees. And I mentioned this lottery bid because we've got a bid ready to go to lottery at the moment that's really seeking to kind of turbocharge that. So some good examples of where we deliver outreach. And again, this is really focused on being in places, in pathways where males are at risk. So top left, terrible picture, but it's Samaritans listening in a custody suite, which we do in a number of places in Wales now. So we go into custody suites, typically on weekend evenings. Often, you know, it's people who found themselves locked up. They're not sure why. They're not in much of a good state. Their life is falling apart. And particularly people who get held over till Sunday mornings are very high risk of self-harm and suicide. So that's, in a very physical sense, us being somewhere where somebody might benefit from a listener. We have high uptake for the listening service in that environment. Bottom left, we've been down at Port Talbot in recent months with all the uncertainty around job losses there, really proactively providing support into the local community and working with Tata to get our support in front of employees there. In the middle centre, festival branch, we have a dedicated branch that goes to all major UK festivals and has huge uptake for its listening support on festivals, on festival sites, often because people are just in a sort of roller coaster ride over the course of a festival weekend where they, for one reason or another, need to open up and share. Top centre is an example of where I'd like us to be and where the lottery bid I'd like us to take us. So is a high risk place. So we know men going through family courts or anywhere really, a housing court, family justice process, hugely stressful, very little support on offer. We'd like to be working with solicitors firms, family law firms, and signposting our support and providing direct support into those environments and arranging callbacks to new clients of family law solicitors where they feel they may be facing difficulty in the months and years ahead. Those processes can often run for years for people. Top right, A&E departments. A number of our branches are in A&E departments, high footfall times, weekends and evenings, where often people are in crisis or have been signposted into A&E because they're a suicidal risk, but aren't really offered any support in those environments. So it's, again, a very physical space. Bottom right, some of our branches like Swansea, Bridgend, go and do kind of beat the street events where they're out on busy nights out. Talking to people often at the end of the night, not providing a street pastor service, but just getting people talking, listening to them, and encouraging to open up in the week if they need to. So just a hint of where we are with outreach and lottery, but again, the aim in the coming years is to support really a turbocharging of that activity and to use the real-time data we now have in Wales to better target that activity so that all the outreach time we're doing in Wales is squarely focused on meeting suicidal risk, not just for men, but I've given some examples for males there. Parental mental health, quickly, we've got a project we're launching later this year. We've done a big survey in Wales, people who've been on the parenting journey. Within that, there was a clear voice from males, men, about their specific challenges as parents and becoming new parents. So definite evidence of lack of support and suicidal thoughts for some, a sense of being sidelined by services. So, it's stuff like on the ward when you've had your baby, or when you get that first midwife appointment, the man kind of feeling like a bit part and not engaged, whilst at the same time knowing and feeling like they want to be fully engaged as a parent, but a system that doesn't seem to know how to sort of treat the male as an equal partner within that process. So we're looking to create a resource to provide into that parenting pathway, to provide to healthcare providers and others, and a range of policy calls. And there'll certainly be asks within that around a challenge to the NHS and others in Wales to rethink and reposition their engagement of fathers and men within that parenting journey. And we've got a big media campaign, sorry Claire, I'll be done soon, which we're launching later this year, which is squarely to engage men. So this is the first Wales only campaign we've run. We don't have big budgets for these things, this is kind of shoestring budget stuff, but we've shot fantastic campaign video. We're just finishing off at the moment. There's a lovely picture from the lane by my house of the shoot. It's not squarely farming focused, that's just one of the shots. But crucially, this campaign, and I guess this takes me full circle, it has a call to actions for men who are in crisis to engage with us or others, but we're also putting a call to action there for people who want to be better listeners. And I think that speaks to what I said earlier, that from Samaritans, you'll see much more of us being generous with our listening skills and trying to meet that deficit, particularly in terms of male suicide risk, not with just a call to people to speak and use their balls and call us, however you do that. I mean, I've never used my balls on a phone, but also a challenge for those people who want to be able to better support their friends and colleagues and family members to be better listeners. And then we've got a ton of resources, training, media guidelines. Go on our website. There's tons of it. I could spend all day going through it. We do training with loads of employers in Wales. We do lots of work with the media. And we've got loads of useful resources, which are signposted to left, right and centre. So I haven't got all day to go through all of those, but I will stop waffling because Claire is giving me that look. Thank you very much.
No, fabulous stuff, Neil. Thank you. And it sounds great to share those listening skills. Something that I always find interesting, that the word listen and the word silent use the same letters. And it's giving that time, isn't it? That's part of the art of listening, isn't it? Is giving people space to talk. And as you alluded to earlier, quite often there's such a temptation to talk about your own experiences when someone's talking to you, but resisting that and giving people that space. So yes, really be great to see that extension of those listening skills far and wide, and really interesting to hear of all the things that you're doing that really do speak to those areas where we know there are the risks prevail. So thank you for your presentation.